The views and opinions expressed here are those of the guests and are not the official position of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
One of the most remarkable aspects of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright.
I'm Matt Henderson, filling in for Nathan Wright. When most of us think of the Mormon migration west, we think of trials and tribulations, death and disease. Although the trail was strewn with such difficulties, it was also a place of much joy and celebration. It was a time of great adventure, a time for singing and dancing, a time for laughing. Joining me in studio today are Mel Bayshore, Michael Landon, and Chad Orton. Mel has been a librarian with the Church History Library for 34 years. He is presently researching and writing interpretive guides for the church historic sites. He administers the Mormon Trail Pioneer Database on the church website, lds.org. In 2000, his popular lecture, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Utah, received a merit award from the Utah Humanities Council. Michael Landon was born in Mesa, Arizona, and after moving to Southern California, joined the church while in high school. He served a mission to Brazil, after which he began his university studies. He received a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from UCLA and a Master's in Public History from California State University, Sacramento. He is an archivist for the Church History Department. As an archivist, Michael has spent many years in collection development, acquiring documents relating to church history, as well as assisting on various departmental projects. His current assignment involves projects connected to church historic sites. Chad Orton has worked for the Church History Department since 1987. He is the author of several articles and books on church history. Among these are studies of the Martin Handcart Company, a history of the Los Angeles Stake, and biographies of the prophet Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. He has just finished editing for publication the Hawaiian Mission Journals of George Q. Cannon. Both sides of my family joined the church early on, ended up in Nauvoo, and came west with the rest of the saints. But growing up in the church with that church history background and that early membership in the church from my family, I never heard about the lighter side of the migration. And I don't think I'm alone in that. Why do you think that is? Why do we not hear much about those things? Mel?
I think it could be because the purpose of life is often described as being a test, that we're here to be tested. And especially the Mormon Trail was a severe test for many. And so often as we look back on it now, it's we look at it with those eyes as a major test for our pioneer saints.
When you give a lecture, when people attend a lecture about the Mormon Trail and they start to hear funny things about the trail, what's the initial reaction of people when they hear funny stories about the trail?
Well, usually they get their defense mechanisms up, and oftentimes when the title of my talk is given and I appear before an audience, I'll get these kind of angry stares at me, and to diffuse that, I will pound the pulpit and say something on the order of funny things happened on the trail, and I dare you to tell me that anything funny happened on the trail, and I think by taking that stance, it sort of diffuses that which they've heard in their entire lives. They're not expecting that there could be anything funny happening on the trail.
And sometimes people mistakenly assume something funny for making fun of, rather than just the lighter side of what's going on. Do you think that's the case?
I do, and I think, too, that these things that happened to the saints as they crossed the plains were not funny at the time.
Right.
But as we look back, and maybe as they looked back later in their lives, as they talked about those experiences, they saw the humor in some things that happened later on. Not just humor, but joy, some of the pleasant things that happened on the trail.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of humor today is at someone else's expense, and so maybe they assume, this isn't very nice to make fun of something, when that's not the case.
Well, and I think when, after they got into Utah and got talking, they discovered that they'd have these common experiences, that they were not alone. It was something that you could share in, reminisce about, talk about your experience, and have a good time recalling what sometimes were hard, difficult days.
And I think human nature, just like in the news today, tends to emphasize those things which are more dramatic and perhaps more gray and more difficult. And the lighter things don't tend to get the visibility that some of the more difficult moments might get. And as a consequence, I think there's this impression that the experience on the trail was so arduous, that's all you can think of it as. You can't think of it as terms of people having a relatively good time. Right. Some people think back on their trail experience, reminiscences, that it was actually, particularly younger people, a pretty free and enjoyable experience.
Yeah. And for the early saints, most of them were already frontiers people, so it wasn't like they were being taken out of a modern city and stuck on the trail.
Well, I think those who were raised in the U.S., for the most part, I think that's true.
Right.
But when you started getting immigrants coming from England,
London or a big city or something,
big city from Europe, this was a brand new experience for all of them. And that's where part of the humor arises, as they were facing new situations that were new to them, in some ways without an owner's manual or instructions on how to deal with these what they're facing.
Can you imagine taking a transplanted Londoner out to the outfitting point, and the captain of the company says, "Brother, go over there and yoke up those ox." That man from England has never seen an ox. He doesn't know a steer from a heifer. We've got a man who was faced with that kind of a situation in 1864, Ovason. And he said, "We did not know which end of the ox to put the yoke." So many of these people were city bred. This was brand new to them.
There was a fellow from England, I think there's both who talked about that he was always the last man to hitch up his oxen every morning. And the reason he says, "I was not slow, I was not incompetent, but I never could figure out which oxen were mine." So he waited until everybody else took theirs, figuring that the last two were his oxen.
And the others could just identify theirs by sight, no problem.
Yeah, he said, "I never could figure out what markings made them mine."
And it wasn't always Europeans. You had people like Abner Blackburn, who eventually was a Mormon battalion member. When he was first asked, he had a very difficult time, and I think his remark, it's kind of the sort of a cowboy poetry phrase. He says, "We were in the road part of the time, and that's when the team was crossing it." You think of this zigzag across the road, unable to keep it...
I tell people that the Mormon Trail in many ways was much wider at the start of the journey than it was at the end, as man and beast got to know each other.
Speaking of Europe, I read one of the stories, and maybe you could relate this, about a man from Denmark, I think it was Denmark, going out to get something to eat.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's, for me, the trail experience, I hike. I love to hike. And for me, the trail experience is, I look on as just one big long hike where you get up in the morning and you take a hike, and the next day you do the same thing. Well, this man, and he was in the 1857 Christian Christiansen Company, And he was an elder man. He'd lost his sense of smell. He'd seen the people in his company going out, the men going out and shooting the buffalo and the antelope and bringing those things back to camp to eat. And he wanted to take part in that food gathering too. And so, as I say, he'd lost his sense of smell. He had a cane, and he went out and saw a little black and white furry thing scurrying around in the sagebrush. And he went over and clubbed that to death and slung it over his shoulder and walked back to camp. And I would assume that 50 yards before he reached camp, they knew he was coming. And in fact, in Scandinavia, they do not have skunks. He intended to have that skunk and make some soup out of it. And the journals do not also mention this, but I would suspect for the next week or so he probably walked downwind from the company.
That's funny. That is funny. So let's go ahead and just open this up, and anybody who has a story that you want to tell, let's just tell a story, and that'll probably spark an idea in someone else, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, let's. Since we've launched with the skunk story, why don't we take some of the other unpleasant things that may have happened going across this trail? Mosquitoes, snakes, dust, wind. Some of those things that may have been very memorable to these people afterwards. Should we start off with snakes?
Okay, now I have only one phobia. And it is snakes. So if you can please make them very funny.
Was it Joseph Smith at Zion's camp saw somebody going to kill a rattlesnake, and he stopped them and got a stick and picked up the stick and carried it off into the brush away. But some of the members of Brigham Young, one of those Brigham Young, did not feel the same way Joseph Smith did about snakes. He wasn't so protective. And he said, when he was in snake country out in Nebraska, he said, I took my cane along, and Brother Heber took his hatchet, and I calculated to pin every snake that came in our way to the ground and have Brother Heber chop their heads off with the hatchet. Matt, does that help you with your phobia?
That helps a lot. Yeah.
That's the kind of story you want to hear. Another one, Willard Richards pulled out his gun when he found a snake blocking his path, and he said he fired at it 3 times with his pistol, but the snake dodged each time. On the 4th shot, he cut him in 2.
Part of the situation, Brigham also talked that there were places where they killed snakes by the cord load.
Wow.
So one of the things you're facing, it's easy to say, let's be careful of this one snake. It's another one. Reality is that you've got all sorts of snakes in your path.
I think it was either Mount Pisgah or Garden Grove, those way stations between Nauvoo and the Missouri River, where the snakes were so thick they had a hard time because their stock kept getting bit.
Wow.
You think about numbers of snakes being that thick. That's...
even so, Mike, in looking through the diaries, I found only about 7 people during the whole course of Mormon immigration that were bitten by a rattlesnake. And none of those 7 died. And there were, half a dozen or so instances of their animals being bitten. In fact, one time a Mormon mule was bitten on his belly by a rattlesnake, and they poured a quart of whiskey down its throat and saved its life. You like that story, Matt? I see you smiling.
Yeah. Well, it was prompting another story I read in one of your writings about somebody coming into camp to get some whiskey for a snake bite.
Yeah, whiskey, alcohol was on the bill of lading that the saints were given as early as when they were in Nauvoo, a list of things they were to take with them as they crossed the plains. And on that list was a gallon of alcohol, whiskey usually, and also 5 pounds of coffee and a pound of tea, too. The whiskey was medicine in that time. And it was used for many purposes, one of which would have been snake bite. So that was probably the best remedy to kill the pain, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there is a story about a man somewhere, I think it was at Whiskey Point, a place called aptly Whiskey Point. And the Mormon company arrived there, and a man met them who was a member of a non-Mormon in a nearby immigrant camp, came to them and asked if they had any whiskey that somebody in their company had been bitten by a rattlesnake. So they they gave him some whiskey to give to this person. And then later on that evening, a half a dozen men came running towards the camp from this non-Mormon camp saying, "Do you have any whiskey? We've been bitten by snakes." And, the Mormons weren't that dumb. So those 6 went back empty-handed. But
Fool me once.
Yeah, fool me once. Another snake story, Thomas Bullock. He was walking on top of a bluff once, and he came close to being bitten by a rattlesnake, and he wrote about that in a letter to his wife, and he says, "I jumped away, and Luke Johnson turned around and blew his head off." I mean, I get the picture of a Clint Eastwood type of character out there. But another one of the medicines that they used were poultices to take care of plasters, and something that was a concoction that was formulated to make your skin warm or hot, to sort of take away the pain. And so they would make these poultices out of different concoctions. Brigham Young's favorite plaster or poultice was made out of turpentine and tobacco. Another one was cornmeal mush tinctured with a tincture of lobelia. Another one, the poultice, was made out of gunpowder and lard, but really the favorite was whiskey for snake bites.
Interesting.
Another story, Mary Bathgate. She was a handcart person, 1856 MacArthur Company, and she was bitten on her leg by a rattlesnake, and she had enough presence of mind, though, to take her garter and put it just above where she'd been bitten, to try and stem the flow of the poison. And she had marched out, and she was a Scottish lady. She'd worked in the mines in Scotland. She was in her 60s. And she was sort of the ringleader of the old people who marched out in front of the handcarts that weren't able to push the carts, and the young children. And they marched out about a half mile in front of the handcart people at the start of the day. And she had this cane, too. She's another one with a cane, and she'd usually twirl it around over their head, yelling, "Hooray for the handcarts!" That would cheer them on. But she was bitten by this snake, and they had some men some of the young children rush back to get some help from the men pushing the handcarts. And they came up, and they cut an incision there where she'd been bitten and tried to suck out the poison. And she had taken pride in marching and walking the whole way so far. And these men said, "Mary, you're going to have to get into a wagon." So she looked around at all the assembled, she was a real feisty lady, and she looked around at all the assembled people and said, "I want you to know that I didn't get into a wagon until these men told me I had to."
Wow.
But she was better after a week or so and started walking the rest of the way again.
Well, you're sitting there talking about whiskey. I always think the story of Gates. What's his?
Hiram Gates.
Hiram Gates.
Hiram, yeah.
Is such a great one, because if whiskey was of such value as a medicine, but his wife, in moving things around the wagon, turned over the whiskey, spilled the whiskey.
Well, actually, the wagon tipped over in a creek, and it exposed the
whiskey.
A barrel of wine. And Gates blamed it on all the women in the wagon, both for the mishap, but he was really upset about the fact that this barrel of wine had been exposed. Well, they couldn't put that to sleep. That whole issue resonated all day long. And, of course, they have a night watchman who makes the rounds. As late at night, and he's making the rounds. I think this was in Brigham Young's 48 company. And he hears Gates and his wife still arguing over this incident that happened earlier in the day. And so it gets close to 11 o'clock, and he yells out, 11 o'clock, all is well. Gates and his wife are fighting like, fill in the end of it. But I don't think they had much more discussion after that. I think things quieted down after that 11 o'clock call.
Usually there were teenage boys assigned to do the night duty or the guard duty, and then during the day they could then ride in the wagon and sleep. But how do you sleep in a wagon bumping across the plains? It just so it was very difficult. It was a hard duty for these teenage boys to do that, and that could lead into our talking about mosquitoes. There was a Philip Hoskins in 1856. He was one of these night guards, and he was out there. I mean, how long can a teenage boy watch oxen and make sure that they're safe at night? I mean, it's pretty dull duty. So they would do things like write poetry, write songs out there on the plains, and while they were watching the cattle to make sure they wouldn't stray away or be stolen by others. And he was thinking too about about all the mosquitoes that he was probably slapping his cheeks trying to keep the mosquitoes away. And so he and my buddies here, I'm going to ask them to join me in a little song. Now, they might not be laughing about this, but this goes to the tune of "Oh, Susanna." And this is a song he composed out there on the plains as he was thinking about the problems of mosquitoes. Are we ready?
We're just reading this, right?
No, we're going to sing this out.
Well, they can't edit.
we know the tune to "Oh, Susanna." Let's give it a shot. All right, here we go. I had a dream the other night when all around was still. I thought I had a mosquito bite and a thrust from his sharp bill. The moon, it looked so very bright, its rays on the water shone. I tried to sleep away that night, but alas for us, there's none. Oh, mosquito, don't you sing so free. I'd rather you were singing at the bottom of the sea.
And you can just see him sitting out on watching the cattle or whatever, and nothing else to do.
You know, and a lot of these especially from Europe, I mean, a lot of these insects, and we're fairly new to them. I mean, they may have experienced them on the ocean coming across, but England doesn't have a great mosquito problem.
Yeah, well, it was a big problem on the plains. There was one fellow, when he got to the end of the trail, and he was reflecting back on his experience, he said, I saw Indians by the hundreds, buffalo by the thousands, and mosquitoes by the billions. And that's with a B. But we had the same experience when the church first started up the Martin's Cove, the Mormon handcart site up in Wyoming. We took a car trip up there to see it, and took some of my older family members, one of my married sons, and we'd taken my family over to the Tetons in that part of Wyoming, but we'd never been in this part of Wyoming where the handcart site is. And as we got closer there, my son said, "Gosh, this is beautiful. Why didn't the Mormons settle this area?" And the minute we parked the car, we knew exactly why they hadn't settled that area. We had forgotten our mosquito repellent, and the mosquitoes were having a convention there, and we took some of those handcarts to push them out to the cove area, and we were with one hand we were holding onto the cart, and the other hand we were slapping the mosquitoes away. But my wife theorized that the reason the Mormons didn't stop there and just kept going was they finally got to the Emigration Canyon, the entrance to Salt Lake Valley, and found that there had been a mosquito abatement program in effect here, and that's why Brigham Young said, this is the right place.
Well, I mean, they say that the two things stop mosquitoes were either the smoke or the wind. If you had the wind, you were safe. So you try to pitch your tent in a place where the wind would be blowing to keep the mosquitoes away. But they talk about that so bad and sometimes that the people would go out and put their sleeping bag, cot, whatever they had, right next to the fire so that they could be covered with smoke so the mosquitoes wouldn't bother them.
It was really difficult. Sometimes the children would go to sleep and be crying till they finally would fall asleep, and then be bitten all night long to the point where they couldn't even open their eyes. They'd swelled up so much from the mosquito bites during the night.
And that's why it's good that we can find humor in this, that they could write a song, and that probably became fairly popular, at least in that company.
Yeah, in fact, Zebulon Jacobs was another one of these teenagers in 1861 who found some humor and wrote about this in his diary. And he in 1861, one of his diary entries reads, in the evening, a meeting was held in camp, but the mosquitoes were there first, and stay there they would. They sang at the opening song. They sang at the closing. And finally they sang all night. Tried to sleep, but they pulled me out of bed. And then the next evening they were having a dance. And this is what's amazing, too, is after a day of crossing the plains, the Mormons would dance. I mean, they were having a great time out on the plains. And he writes in his journal that evening that we had a gay ball this evening. We had the large and renowned band of minstrels composed of mosquitoes, which kept us dancing all night. And can't you just picture the romantic scene here? The full moon, and the mosquitoes are just making them really hop around.
Wow. The good thing is they were able to keep their perspective. They weren't losing sight of what was happening, what joy they could find because of the trials that they were facing. One of the things that was really quite a great counsel to the saints, I believe, was Section 136. Particularly in there it says, when you are, praise the Lord, sing, dance. And this really helped the pioneers through their, difficult times that they would face. At the end of the day, they could sit there and dance and sing, and in spite of what was going on.
Even those the Martin Handcart Company, and when the weather was the worst, they would have their meetings and they would sing out there with a foot of snow on the ground and sometimes below zero weather. I mean, it's just, I just can't understand how that could happen. And also that we have a record of these things, too, recording under, jotting things down in a journal. I can't imagine after you've hiked in the dust and the swatted mosquitoes and fought the snakes all day to then sit down by some smoky campfire and jot down what you have just experienced that day. That is amazing that we have such a rich record from this time. Should we go into wind and the dust?
Well, there's some great accounts of dust. There's a non-member, John Benson, who was actually invited to the first days of 47, if you really want to call it that, 1849. They had this great celebration. And there were a few hundred immigrants, non-Mormon immigrants in town. They were invited to come and eat. And he made an observation about how incredible the progress they'd made in just 2 years. But as he left the city, he was going north on what they call the Salt Lake Cutoff. It was a route that you could take north out of Salt Lake, which eventually would hook up with the main California Trail coming down from Fort Hall. And even though he was miles and miles away from it, he knew that he was approaching that connecting point with the main trail, because he said you could see the dust clouds, he said, like the steam from so many steamships from the wagon trains miles off in separate units. So he could even count the number of trains, because there are these separate dust clouds, enormous billowing dust clouds off in the distance, representing wagons that were traveling down that portion of the California Trail. It intersected pretty close to where City of Rocks is located today in southern Idaho. But he knew that they were approaching it long before they ever got there, just based on the dust. Dust was wherever they could try to go abreast and not follow in single file, they'd do it, not to eat each other's dust. Of course, that wasn't always feasible, but to the extent that they could, nobody wanted to. And they often had the rotation system where, you're at the front for a day, and then you rotate back to the back. And oftentimes wagons that could not keep up for whatever reason, their yoke keeps breaking or whatever, unfortunately had the distinction of eating a lot of dust because they had to catch up. There's one account of a small train that was crossing Nevada going to California, and they didn't. They had some trouble and had to stop, and then they had to race to catch up with a larger company because they were exposed being so small. Well, when they got up to this big company, they didn't have they wouldn't rotate for them, so they had to stay at the back. But they were still grateful that they were with a larger company from a protection standpoint, even though they had to eat this tremendous amount of dust every single day. It's really hard to imagine. If you've gone down a dirt road in Nevada behind somebody, it's that fine dust, almost chalk-like, that just gets into everything. And I once was on a bus, one of our nice UTA buses, going home, and the air conditioning went out. This was in July. It was one of the new buses, and so you couldn't open any windows. I'm telling you, the people on that bus were getting pretty upset because there's a traffic jam, and my gosh, we were going to have to be in that bus for maybe 20 minutes with all this heat. And I told the guy, I says, you could be in this kind of heat every day for 90 days and eat dust along with it from the moment you departed to the moment you stopped. So he says, you're right. Perspective is everything. So that little bus experience didn't seem quite so onerous when you put it in perspective of what some other people have done in the past. That's the other thing I like about it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're captivated by the Overland experience, is because we can make comparatives. And the perspective that it gives you, I think, is useful when you face your day-to-day trivial trials sometimes.
Dust was not just problems for humans. Josiah Gibbs was a 12-year-old boy who driving his oxen. He presents this picture of the oxen. The dust would get in their eyes to the point where they would be crying almost like tears. That it would bother them so well. But it kind of reminded me that, on the trail, on the first part, one of the problems, or at least people talked about, is that, Brigham Young would start the day at the front of the company, and by the end, regularly he'd be at the back eating the dust. And it's like, well, Brigham, you need to be out in front, and he'd eventually keep working his way back. But years later, when he would travel to the Saints, he would go around to the various settlements. People would talk about the hideous pair of goggles that he used to wear to keep the dust out of his eyes. He'd had that experience.
You could buy goggles at the outfitting place, and some did, or they would use handkerchiefs to try and keep the dust out of their mouths and nose. There is a story, Mike spoke about the rotation of sharing the dust duty, and there were a company in 1847, and there were two 50s, and they were going in parallel form across the plains. There would be one 50 on one side and the other 50 right next to it, going parallel across the plains, the wagons. And the wind was blowing sidewards, so the company on the north side heading west ate dust for 2 days. And at that campfire that night, they said, "This is not fair. We need to change." So the next day they changed the order, and guess which way the wind blew the next day?
It's kind of like whenever I go camping, no matter which side of the fire I stand on, the smoke seems to be coming that direction.
Right. We've talked about the plains here quite a bit, and I guess it's kind of open-ended here. These were pioneers coming across the plains, but when they got here, they were pioneers too, and I think we can bring some of that aspect into this too. Many of these people who came across the plains were Scandinavians, and many of them ended up settling down in San Pete County, and there's a lot of stories that come out of the Scandinavians and how funny they were down in San Pete County. For instance, there's a story about one lady that she got mad at her husband one day, and they were inside the house, and she started chasing him around the bed and trying to, with her broom, and he slid underneath the bed, and she says, come out, you coward." He says, "I will not. I will show you who is the boss in this house." There's another situation. They all had sort of similar names down there, too. And one time there was a general authority visiting down in Ephraim. And at the close of the meeting, he said, "Would Brother Peterson please give the closing prayer?" And half the congregation stood up and started to come forward. And he said, "No, I mean Brother Peter Peterson." And then 4 of them sat down. Another time there was an old Danish brother that had a dream about the hereafter. He dreamed that he went up to St. Peter at the pearly gates, and St. Peter told him that he couldn't come in, but that he had to go downstairs. So he went down the stairs and opened the door, and inside was every friend that he'd ever had on earth. And he had a great time, and then a red light came on for him to leave and to come back to earth, and from the depths of his heart he admitted that he never was so sorry he wasn't dead. He said, "Of course, it was a little bit hot down there, but who cares about the weather if you can be with your friends?" There was another one during Heber J. Grant's time period. He was just about every general conference he'd work into it obedience to the word of wisdom. And there was 2 old ladies sitting around their kitchen table down in Ephraim, having a cup of coffee, listening to general conference. And one of the ladies got a little uncomfortable and said, "Well, maybe we should stop drinking the coffee. Maybe we could have that kind of coffee that has the caffeine taken out of it." And the other lady says, "I don't know. I think President Grant would still say that is a sin. And if I am going to sin, I would rather sin with the Hills Brothers."
We talked earlier, and I remember a story, and a couple of stories that I particularly love that talk about, Henrietta E. Williams recalled the following one of the times when they stopped as a group to repair their wagons. She wrote down, "They knew that I was no cook, but left that job for me. I built a fire after gathering buffalo chips and getting it started. And after getting it started, the wind played with it as it pleased. I put the Dutch oven on to heat with the cover by the side of it. I made a pie of dry apples, putting it in the oven, and turned towards the wagon several yards away from the fire for safety. A nice cow sneaked up and helped himself to the pie, and then sneaked off. When a girl called to my attention to look at my rice, since she'd been paying attention to the pie, the rice was now burning. I had a hard time cooking the biscuits as I was jumping in and out of the wagon, climbing over the provision box, watching my baby girl, and getting what my husband wanted, as it was his misfortune never to find anything he was looking for. And the fire had its own way of burning. At that time I thought, O Zion, will we ever reach thee?
Wow.
Yeah,
And this was probably a fairly common day for her.
it was a fairly common day, but, one of the things that, they looked at was, you watch these new skills they had to learn. Go out and to start a fire with buffalo chips, to go out and choose buffalo chips. They would talk about when the wind would blow the wrong way, that your food would become seasoned with buffalo chip.
And of course, they had sometimes skills that hadn't been seen by others. You have the story I like is at Fort Laramie. There's this young boy. His name is Christopher Jacobs, and he's kind of an athlete, kind of an acrobat type guy. And his friends asked him to do some acrobatics. Well, Laramie, there's always Indians around, and so Jacobs does a couple of somersaults, and they'd never seen anything like that. And so he wrote that the Indians gathered around, and I turned a couple of somersaults. They were amazed. They stood on the ground and jumped up and down on it to see if it would spring with them. Finding that the ground was solid, they came and felt of my legs and talked among themselves, much surprised that such a thing was possible.
Wow.
The idea of, interacting with Native Americans and all kinds of people. I mean, that's, the whole idea of the American West as a sort of the Frederick Jackson Turner concept, this idea that you're going to, everyone's on the same playing field. Mm-hmm. You're going to encounter people from every stripe, every locality, every type of background, and the learning curve that is associated with that as you meet and intermingle. I think these Indians probably wondered and thought about what Jacobs was doing. But on the other hand, they also would pitch in. And we've got accounts of where Indians actually helped some of the handcart people pull some of their wagons on occasion. And I think it was B.H. Roberts who was told to stay with his wagon and didn't always do as he was told. And he and a friend were trailing behind. And some Indians came up. They saw him, and they were fearful for their lives, and so they were running for all they were worth to get back to the train. And they glanced back and hear the Indians just having a good laugh. That scared these the wits out of these two little guys, running for all they're worth.
Speaking of it kind of triggered my memory, the apron, the gathering of buffalo chips, and there was a woman who was expecting, and one day she was gathering her buffalo chips in her apron, and the next day she had come back to camp and had given birth out in the sagebrush, and was bringing her infant back in the same apron that she'd gathered buffalo chips in the day before. And we have instances where the company, there may be a woman give birth out on the plains, and within an hour or so, or two, that company is on the move again. It just, and was it Wallace Stegner who said, do you know, Chad? Do you have that?
Well, I don't.
Yeah, I think it was something like the Mormon men were strong, the Mormon women were amazing.
Yes.
Or something like that.
Because what they had to go through, whether on the wagon train or hand carts. Betsy Webster gave birth after a long day, and the next day the company traveled 16 miles. That she didn't have a chance to rest.
And resting, in a wagon. I imagine she was in the wagon the next day. But the bumping.
It's not comfortable. There are no shocks.
No.
There are no rubber wheels.
And it's both sexes. We were talking yesterday about James Godson Blake getting sick and having to leave his cart because he wasn't able to pull it. And this is in the Sandhills of Nebraska. This is before, James Godson Blake was in the Martin Company. And before they ever got into the the inclement weather, they still had to cross the Sandhill area. And Francis Webster, another company member, Blake wrote this down, picked Blake up and put him on his own handcart and hauled him 17 miles.
Wow.
So he wouldn't, and this is in the Sandhills. So he wouldn't get left behind.
And at the time, Webster is the only one pulling his handcart. Most people normally have 2 or 3
So he was doing it solo. With the regular equipage, plus Blake.
And at that time,
through the sand, 17 miles.
I can't imagine walking through sand.
No.
17 miles.
And, this is Francis Webster, the man who did this, is the famous old man in the corner of the Sunday school class.
Down in Cedar City.
In Cedar City. I don't know if you remember that.
No, go ahead.
That story where he gets up and when people are criticizing the handcarts for coming so late in the year,
right,
says,
right.
I came by there, and so did my wife, and we were blessed as a result. And I think this is one of the stories that shows why Francis Webster was blessed. If you read his statement, we tend to associate, he said, as I was going along, I felt the angels were there helping me push my handcart. And we tend to associate that with the snows of Wyoming. But if you read it, he actually talks about the sand. Mm-hmm. And it's my personal opinion, because we don't have a record, that what he was talking about was this particular day when he's carrying Blake, that he's taken Blake onto his handcart. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'd see a patch of sand and think, I can't go through there. I can't go ahead. But the Lord recognized what he needed, and he was able to fill in.
And it tended to bond. These two families were already close, but it bonded them even further. I think James Godson Blake named one of his sons Francis Webster Blake, and Webster named one of his sons James Godson Webster. Wow. So these were two remarkable men. And the thing I really enjoy about their story is the idea of perspective, that they refused to be discouraged irrespective of circumstance. They weren't going to be discouraged. That one man, Blake, is sort of a story unto himself, because he can provide anyone can see and understand sacrifice and willingness to commit to a cause. But in Blake's case, it's the attitude that irrespective of what gets thrown at me, I'm going to overcome this difficult circumstance. It helps anyone who reads that story and internalizes it. It can help but make them understand and put in perspective their own kettle of fish that they're trying to fry at the moment. The difficulties they've got in their life, mm-hmm. and they think about somebody who went through this horrific experience of Martin's Cove and the Willie and Martin companies, and not be bitter, because he had every reason to. He could have mm-hmm. been embittered by his experience. Look what's happened to me, but he didn't do that. I think it's very instructive. Sometimes we get a sour taste in our mouth over some really minor things, and
like sitting in a bus for 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And I think that's the wonderful thing about the pioneers. They have all these horrible experiences. Dinner is burned. You dealt with mosquitoes, but they could keep things in proper perspective.
They could sing at the end of the day.
They could sing at the end of the day.
They did.
And I think they often did look at it as a metaphor. They made the connection between we're on this journey to Zion, and just like we're on this journey of life, and that wasn't lost on them. I think it was one of George Jay's wives, when she arrived in the valley in 1949, she talks about this meeting her family, and they had this huge feast prepared for her, and there's this incredible homecoming, and she actually wrote, she said, this is a foretaste of the resurrection of the just. Mm-hmm. So she had made in her mind this connection between having done this trip across the plains and I'm being rewarded for my sacrifices. I overcame the obstacles, and now I'm with my family. And, you take that I concept, and you can see how it would be easy to make the association for those people.
Mm-hmm.
And the saints, too, made an association with Old Testament times. They thought of themselves as, they called themselves the Camp of Israel.
Right.
And they pictured what they were doing as sort of similar to what had been done in the Old Testament time. And, now that I think of it, weren't those Old Testament people lucky? They got to hike for 40 years.
In fact, Brigham Young chewed out the Vanguard Company for sort of light-mindedness and not really taking seriously what they were about and what they were supposed to be doing. You are the Camp of Israel, and you are the Vanguard Company, and you've got responsibilities. Well, I can't have you playing cards and rushing off every afternoon to hunt. That you've got some serious responsibilities here.
And we think of the term pioneer to be all-encompassing today of all those people, but back then, the saints thought that the real pioneers, the only pioneers, were the Brigham Young's first company. They didn't even consider themselves to be pioneers.
Because somebody had already gone before.
Because somebody had gone before.
Uh-huh.
They were just doing what needed to be done.
Yeah.
One of the things that along that we celebrate our pioneers as we should. The blessed, honored pioneers. As Mike was talking, I kind of have reminded that of the phrase "faith in every footsteps." And while I like the concept, I sometimes get troubled by how we interpret it. That every pioneer who started the journey ended at their faith having increased, or the reality is that there were those who also went along the journey and their faith decreased with every step that they took. They still had faith, but it was less. There are those who seemed to go along the journey and it didn't change much one way or the other. And I think the Pioneer Trek is one of the great metaphors for life, that we get out of the journey what we put into it, what we are looking for. If people at the end of the day were seeing the hand of God, His tender mercies with them, then their faith did grow. If at the end of the day all they saw were the mosquitoes and the problems and the challenges, then their faith was diminishing. One of the great things that I love about the pioneers, the story, is how often you would hear stories about someone who was having a problem where the rest of the company would stop, or members would drop out and go off and help them. There was one woman whose wagon was fairly weak. She was having problems with it. They kept having the yoke break on their oxen. They'd have to hook it. They'd repair it with rawhide straps. But this one particular day, her wagon is quite far behind. Her husband's been sick the entire time, so he's laying in the back of the wagon. She's got 2 kids, so she's left to her to drive the oxen, a new experience for her. And on this particular day, they're traveling late, and about sunset, the oxen break away from the wagon, and so they take off. And so she's left there with a husband who can't help her. She's got the 2 kids. She looks around, it's pitch black, try to find something to build a fire. She has nothing. And she'd say, I could hear the wolves howling around me. And so she sat there on the seat of the wagon with an axe, thinking, I'm going to have to scare off the wolves. This is how I'm going to spend the night. And she said that went along, but about midnight, men from the company came back and found her. They had finally realized she was not with them, and came back and helped. But we hear of stories all the time of these pioneers helping each other, which is a fairly wonderful thing for them to do, I think some ways kind of unique. In most immigrant companies, that's your problem. We're moving down the road.
Right. And in the case there, it's this idea, the other concept of she's done everything she can do. She can't do any more. And then she receives the help that she needs in order to accomplish the task. And, there's a metaphor in that, too.
One of those great rescuers.
That's right.
These people were asked to frequently do things that weren't easy. They were new to them. I mean, Wallace Stegner, what he said about the handcarts, they'd never pitched a tent. They'd never slept on the ground, never built a campfire. They were experiencing, they didn't have the skills that were necessary to do these things. I think it's a great lesson to us, because we will be occasionally asked to do things that are out of our comfort zone, that we may not have the skills for, but yet that we can do these things. We can do the hard things. And there may be challenges along the way, but we can also remember that there will be joy and happiness on our journey if we will look for that joy and happiness even among the trials that we face. I was looking here, what Stegner wrote, is it turned out they didn't have the rudimentary skills to make frontiersmen, but they had the stuff that makes heroes. And I think that that's a lesson that we can all learn in our everyday lives.
Thank you. We've been visiting today with Mel Bayshore, Michael Landon, and Chad Orton of the Church History Department. Thanks for joining us.